Stragglers, come on in. Well, welcome. All right. Well, our last and final week in the book of Exodus, hitting another 10 chapters. We'll slow down a little bit with our pace in Leviticus because we'll thankfully have only 27 chapters to cover in 4 weeks. And then I'll actually have, should nothing strange and totally unexpected happen, an extra week to throw in somewhere for Numbers or Deuteronomy to give us a little bit more time to kind of look intently at what's going on there. So hopefully in the weeks to come, we'll get a chance to slow this down just a bit. But having said that, let's jump on in and get into this. All right, so from where we left off last week, ending in chapter 30, we have come right up to the precipice of what's about to transpire and what can perhaps be considered maybe the theological heart of this book in and of itself. Because the back half, of course, while the book itself is named for the Exodus, the whole back half of the book is them leaving out probably back 2/3 of the book, leaving out from the land of Egypt and then coming unto the Lord at Sinai. And then with that, how they enter into this covenant union with him and how he begins to expound to them what he expects. They come to learn how to relate and interface with this God relationally and spiritually as goes his holiness. And of course, the biggest mistake that they can make comes right at the heart of that little chiasm in the middle of the screen there. I'm going to elaborate on that more as we unpack this some. But last week we ended with 5 chapters worth of instructional information that God had given to Moses, and he is about to relay to the people. But even though it seems like it's repetitious, we must understand that on this side, the 20s chapter corridor, from the 30s chapter corridor, the 20s are Moses up on the mountain receiving the instructions. The 30s is Moses having now come down from the mountain and relaying these instructions, and then they get busy with the process of actually building it. But to give you kind of something of a rudimentary breakdown of how this information is laid out, because it does seem quite repetitious. In fact, in lots of cases, everything that is said over here in the 20s is going to be almost completely recapitulated word for word, with the only variant changing is instead of the Lord saying to Moses, it is, and they made, or and he made, and then it just drills down right into the specifics as goes dimensionality and or whatever metal might have been used or whatever the case might be to demonstrate it was made to the exact specificity as goes the pattern shown Moses on the mountain. And how careful he was to remember that, as he was told over and over again, to make sure that's what he did. But one thing that we pointed out last week was something of the breakdown as goes when we get into these chapters here. We are first getting the most intimate piece of tabernacle furniture first, as goes the ark. And then, of course, working out from there, the table, the lampstand. We aren't given the altar of incense yet, even though that is just on the other side of that curtain that separates the holy from the most holy space. And I'll remind us of why that's the case here in just a second. But then in chapter 26, we get the instructions for how the tabernacle is made. Just to make sure we're all aware, when we say tabernacle, we're not talking about the entire structure that usually you wind up seeing when you look up or Google a picture of it, because with that, what you're typically going to get is the complete picture of the tent itself, then the outer court with those linen curtains, and then those pieces of furniture that exist between the tabernacle itself and the screen of the outer court. And the reason why is because it's not that it isn't part of the tabernacle, but the whole business of what goes on in the tabernacle that's most important, that relates and revolves around God's holiness and the symbolism as how he is relating to this nation, happens within what is going to become called the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, or the Hebrew word I give you here, the Mishkan, okay? Because I want us to become somewhat familiar with that. If we start to get involved in lexical work through the rest of our study outside of Torah, we'll come across this word in various other places and Greek equivalents of it in the New Testament. So when we get used to reading that word and thinking of it as God's dwelling place, not that we have to pronounce it correctly or anything like that. It's just a simple idea of perhaps sometimes we bring certain types of baggage to some words, ergo tabernacle, and we get our minds fixated on the idea of it's this particular structure, when in and of itself, it's not just a noun, it's a verb also. And understanding the verbal aspect of this is that God's desire to dwell amongst His people is indeed tabernacling. And this is the very idea, of course, as many of you probably already know, that John is trying to capture in the opening chapters of his gospel when he speaks about Jesus becoming flesh and the Word of God tabernacling amongst us. Anyway, so the support structures for the Mishkan, the actual tent in and of itself that's on the inner side of the tabernacle, or the tabernacle structure. Then instructions for the altar of the burnt offering. So then we move away from there and we get to the outer furnishings. And then we have this interlude where we're told about how they are to construct the priestly garments. So with that, the understanding that somebody's got to be the person who is the only person allowed to go into this inner sanctum and do the ministry. And then after that, we jump into the altar of incense, bronze basin, and of course the oil and the incense that's used, because all of that is spoken of, as goes Aaron's responsibility for burning the incense, washing at the basin, and then that only the priests have the ability to use this oil and this incense. After we get done with that, then we jump over into chapter 31. We've got provision of skilled workers. These two that are mentioned, Bezalel, who comes from the tribe of Judah, and there's something to that, a separate study in and of itself. But nonetheless, Bezalel and Oholiab. And after this promise of providing these two whom God is going to fill with His Spirit to guide them in this process of creating, then there's this command to observe the Sabbath. God gives Moses these 2 stone tablets that has the Decalogue, 10 Commandments written on it. Then the covenant's broken. But then, funny enough, after that, we get into chapter 35. And the whole reason why I put this slide together is because it's part of the drudgery, I think, that we encounter when we start reading the Bible and we get to parts of it like this where we're like, I'm just getting the same stuff over again. Why is it that it seems like it's just being repeated back to me? And when you consider all the narrative space from 35 virtually through 39 that's being dedicated to readdressing everything that's being said from chapter 25 through 30, you wonder, is this just a waste? Am I missing something? Surely there's got to be a more significant reason to this. And so that's part of our goal tonight, is to try to understand and unpack some of that understanding. But in chapter 35, we look back and see what happened in chapter 31 through the lens of chapter 32, and we can't underscore how bad chapter 32 was. It was fatal for many who were involved. Thousands wind up dying. But nonetheless, as God moves on with this nation and His agenda and promise with them, He yet again resurrects the concept of observing the Sabbath. Then offerings and volunteers, of which this duo of Bezalel and Oholiab are compelled, and these two people are told the Lord is going to fill them, indwell them, endow them with knowledge to be able to do this. And then new stone tablets are carved, and then we go back to what we have in 25 through 30 in almost the exact same order, except for we start first with the discussion about how the support structures for the Mishkan. Remember, this is just the beams, crossbars, walls, curtains, and everything that's going to form those 2 chambers that become the tent of meeting. And then we have the complete order that's given over here in 25 through 30, repeated over here, with the exception of priestly garments are the last thing that are mentioned. And of course, that predicates what's going to come right behind that, and that is the material in chapter 40. I just want to remind us what we looked at last week and how this parallels the creation account with 7 separate, very small, abbreviated speeches in Genesis chapter 1, as goes the 6 active days of creation and the 7th day of rest, and how there are 7 separate speeches. It's not really impactful, as goes the concept of what contains the volume of the speech on the Exodus side. In other words, when you get into it, it's not like you can try to line up point for point anything that might correlate for a day of creation to a speech or a part of the speech that God is giving for the tabernacle. That's not the point. The point is there, from the Hebrew rendering of this, apparently at least an interlude of some sort, when we have the formula recycled again of, then God said to Moses. And because there are 7 separate distinctions of that, and considering how the number 7 is embedded in so many different places, especially when we get into the book of Leviticus. We're going to see that number come up again and again in various different ways, in all the different places you might expect to see it, from 7 days in a week that ends in a Sabbath to 7 months until we get to the most, busiest, I guess I should say, most fun-filled month on the calendar. The 7th month is when we have the most feasts jammed into it. And then, of course, 7 years, that reaches a sabbatical end and a celebratory feast that comes with that. And then 7 cycles of 7 years, or 7 sabbatical cycles that end in the year of Jubilee, and various other things like that. So anywhere we wind up finding something like this, as goes an ordering of sevens, it means something. And so it's meant to clearly reflect and harken back to the concept of creation. And of course, it should not be lost on us that when we consider the idea of what's actually being said here in chapter 31, as God speaks about what he's going to do with these two characters of Bezalel and Aholiab, it begins to amp up this creation speech that we start to see popping off the page, or hopefully begin to see popping off the page to us, to help us understand just how deeply intertwined the concept of tabernacle, Mishkan, God's dwelling place with these people, and what it means theologically, and of course how it ties to creation. So if you will, turn in your Bible to Exodus 31. We are going to read some Bible, first 6 verses, then we're going to jump down to verses 12 through 17. All right. So the Lord spoke to Moses, "Look, I have appointed by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with God's Spirit, with wisdom, understanding, and ability in every craft, to design artistic works in gold, silver, bronze, to cut gemstones for mounting, and to carve wood for work in every craft. I have also selected Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, to be with him. And I have put wisdom in the heart of every skilled artisan in order to make all that I have commanded you." So when you consider that, go back to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. The Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. While we have not yet explored a part of the Bible like this, we do have the ability to kind of pull and cheat a little bit from other areas to help us better understand what is actually going on in creation, because thankfully we have the writings of psalmists, Proverbs, and occasionally some poetic literature that's embedded somewhere in the writings of the prophets that give us extra layers of dimensionality to the creation account itself. Granted, some of it's poetic and thereby hyperbolic speech, a little bit exaggerative, but nonetheless, it helps us understand a little bit more of the creative energy and force behind what God is doing. Hence, Proverbs 3:19, "The Lord founded the earth by wisdom and established the heavens by understanding." So considering that, as we go back to Exodus 31 and these verses that we just read, and that God is saying, "I have filled him," that being Bezalel, Aholiab, with God's Spirit, with wisdom, understanding, and ability in every craft. That word craft in Hebrew is workmanship, which is the exact same word that's being used of what God is looking back on and reflecting upon that he declares good in Genesis chapter 1. So considering all these hyperlinks of God's Spirit being active in Genesis chapter 1, and that now God is going to fill these two men with his Spirit, what is the telos, or end point, for which he is filling them with? What is he filling them with this Spirit to do? It's okay, we've already read it. You can just say it. What is he filling them with his Spirit to accomplish? Understanding, yes. Okay, so he wants them to understand what he is revealing to them, as goes plans. We have no record whatsoever of Moses actually copying down any pattern. Not to say he couldn't have done that. We have multiple references to said pattern. But nonetheless, the way that most of us, I think, kind of envision this is that God is just opening their minds, and he is helping them understand exactly what they are supposed to craft. And how that is, considering we have images of cherubim, and supposedly none of them have ever seen a cherubim. How would they know what that creature is supposed to look like? Are they supposed to draw upon other ancient Near Eastern motifs? I mean, for the most part, that word in the most ancient realms of antiquity we can reach back to is a Mesopotamian word. It predates any semblance of Hebrew culture by centuries. So, of course, they're the first to erect the design of what would be called and understood as a cherubim in their own art. And of course, there are some similarities that are shared between those renderings. Doesn't mean they borrowed and copied. It just means, what did they know of what a creature like that looked like? And of course, because no other structure like this has ever existed before, and there are some similarities to how other temples and shrines may be built and or function, there are quite a few very stark differences between those structures. And of course, it's meant to be portable. In every way, it's meant to be broken down, packed up, carried in carts on the backs of beasts of burdens, or on the shoulders of human beings dedicated for that. So lots and lots of wisdom for the sake of discernment. But when it comes to God implementing wisdom or using wisdom as part of His creative force for putting the cosmos into play, it's a little different than just discerning what is being revealed, because nothing is being revealed to God. He has purpose and intentionality behind everything. So that would also have to be a part of this as well, right? To understand how everything fits together, what its function and purpose is. But beyond that, what it ultimately speaks back to is the idea that this creation that they are going to be spearheading is in every way, shape, and form exactly what we've been saying it is over these many weeks, and that is a scaled down microcosmic version of the larger macrocosmic reality of God's cosmos and the temple that existed within it at the beginning of the story, the Genesis prologue of chapters 1 through 3, heaven and earth united in that sacred space of Eden, and that is what this is supposed to recapitulate. All right, let's look at verses 12 through 17. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, so that you will know that I am the Lord who consecrates you. Observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Whoever profanes it must be put to death. If anyone does work on it, that person must be cut off from his people. Work may be done for 6 days, but on the seventh day there must be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath day must be put to death. The Israelites must observe the Sabbath, celebrating it throughout their generations as a permanent covenant. It is a sign forever between me and the Israelites, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, but on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed." Now, just as a heads up, we're going to see the mentioning of Sabbath observance multiple times in a very short space, as goes the literary layout of chapters 31 through 35. And there's got to be reason and purpose for why it's mentioned so many times. But before we get to that, this being the first of those occurrences, notice I've tried to keep the color scheme on the bottom side of this somewhat purposeful for you from the slides that we've had in previous weeks, from looking at patterns and implications and anticipation. The orange representing the pattern. The blue, while there's no text assigned to that, is there are obvious implications coming from the pattern itself, and then what can we anticipate? If this whole construct is being mimicked, as goes 7 separate distinct speeches that God lays out its design in and all of its aspects that He is imparting now to Moses, and He's using these words that are meant to clearly hyperlink to the Genesis prologue of God's Spirit, who's an agent of creation, God's wisdom, who from the writer of Proverbs we understand also is a part of God's creative energy, focus, resource bank, and whatnot that He is using and threading into everything that He creates. And He is giving this to them for the sake of them accomplishing the complete level of skill and craftsmanship and what they're designing. And again, craft being from the Hebrew word of workmanship, and that too connecting directly to Genesis chapters 1 through 2. We've got all this creation stuff wrapped up in it. We go back to Genesis 2. How do we see God capping off the creation week at the beginning of that chapter? God had completed His work that He had done. He rested on the seventh day. He blesses the seventh day. He declares it holy. For on it He rested from all of His work of creation. That becomes the pattern. There's implications with that. Resting, it's set apart, it's holy. It's the first use of that word holy we have anywhere in Scripture. The term Sabbath isn't mentioned, but of course that winds up becoming the nomenclature that's used for the day. And while there's no mention of it up until this particular point, God is really hammering the point home of you must observe my Sabbaths. So what would we anticipate then as goes all of this talk about this new creative work that God is blessing people with His Spirit, with wisdom, to fashion in order for Him to dwell amongst them? We should anticipate that He would then cap this off with some sort of speech about observing His Sabbath. And lo and behold, that's what we have. And of course, this is one of the heaviest moments in which God really hits home or hammers home what exactly the intent behind this is. A complete day of rest. I take it seriously enough that if you violate this, I'm willing to have you put to death. And we actually have a moment of this very thing occurring for us in the book of Numbers. So, with that set aside, what we are coming to understand is that with this, God is telling them, this is what I want you focused on while you're here. I have not given any instruction to Moses about where you're to go beyond this. I've not even given him a timetable of when you can expect to leave. You're not leaving this place until this is put together. So if here they are around this mountain, God is providing everything they need, water, manna, occasionally some protein source like quail or whatnot. But they, in a large part, are just immersed in desert. And they anticipate going to this promised land that God is going to take them to, that it's been described multiple times as a land flowing with milk and honey, so obviously bursting with abundance. If you or I were in that situation, how high do you think our level of anticipation would be to get to that end point? And better yet, if you've got but one task that stands between you and that this has to be accomplished, and it really boils down to how fast you can work to get it done, what would your normal MO be? Let's get it done. Let's strap up our boots, roll up our sleeves, and let's dedicate all of our time, energy, and effort and resources into it. And after all, what else do we have to do? We've got livestock to tend to, but most of that kind of takes care of itself. And we've got hundreds of thousands of people that can, for the most part, be dedicated to various different aspects of work. So as long as we've got these two guys acting as the foreman, directing the workflow and whatnot, man, we can really knock this thing out. Not to say it's going to be done in a week or two, but not to say at this point they're anticipating having to take a full year to even get it done. Who knows how long it will take? But the one thing that God does not want is an endless work cycle. 24 hours, 7 days a week, endless shifts, because if we can work with this great big pillar of fire standing here, or this mountain behind us that occasionally gets consumed with fire, or God's glory showing up above this tent that Moses pitched over here, we might have enough light to do some work, even at nighttime. God does not want that. That everything has to come to a complete grinding halt come sundown Friday evening, which the evening, of course, begins the concourse of the next day that comes after that, and that means Sabbath begins Friday evening. And at that point, nothing is done. Absolutely nothing is to be done. You are to stay in your tent. You're not to go outside and collect manna, not even sticks. You are to stay there and enjoy the comfort that you have of leisure with your family and enjoying this covenant union and relationship that you have with me. That's what God is ultimately going to be driving forth toward. All right, Exodus chapter 32. So let's jump there, and we're going to read the first 6 verses. Then we'll jump down to the bottom half of the chapter. So when the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down, because Moses didn't give them a timetable. He didn't go and tell them, hey, I will be up there for 40 days, 40 nights. Don't anticipate that I'm going to come down any sooner than that. Don't worry about me, though, because if something were to happen to me up on the mountain, you're not going to know it unless somebody comes and tries to track me down. But I wouldn't even bother coming to look for me until at least after 40 days, because you can guarantee I'll be up there. He just goes up there. He goes up there. And we might have it built into our minds, as goes this scenery, that God's presence in this fiery, smoky, thunderous cloud that descended upon it in Exodus 19 is just perpetually on the summit of this mountain. But that's not in the text for us. That doesn't mean that we have to shift the pendulum all the way to the opposite side and think that it's not there. But because we don't have perpetual mention of it, it's possible that this theophanic expression of God coming down like that may have ceased after those hours that he took to speak to Moses, or after the days that Moses is up there. Because remember, he, elders, and a couple of other people go up there and they experience a fellowship meal with God, who appears in humanoid form over a plane of sapphire-looking glass and whatnot. And then Moses separates himself from those people. They go back down. Moses waits another 6 days while the cloud covers the mountain. Then he goes into the cloud, into God's presence. Maybe the cloud leaves the mountain. It's important for us to try to get a better picture of what's going on here, because when we consider the verbology of what's about to be said here and the way that these people come at Aaron, they may have had good reason to suspect that Moses might not be coming back. Because if God's glory cloud, or whatever you want to call that, has left the mountain, and there's no sound up on the mountain, there's no evidence of Moses even still being alive, and he never told us when he was going to come back down. He went up there, but why in the world would anybody have a need to be up there for 40 days? Joshua's down here with us, or someone might think. Maybe he makes a couple of trips back and forth, who knows? But nonetheless, maybe they think the same thing about Joshua, that he's gone too. Nobody has heard or seen anything of this Moses character. And if nobody's been taking him food, how in the world could he have possibly survived for 40 days and 40 nights while he's up there? Because obviously they waited quite some time if Moses had been up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the moment of the event that occurs in Exodus 32, God tells him to get down off the mountain. This wasn't a week. It wasn't 2 weeks into it. It was at the end of that 40-day cycle. So anyway, they see he's delayed in coming down from the mountain. They gathered around Aaron and they said to him, "Come, make gods for us." Another possible Hebrew variant reading of that could be God. Make a god, little g, for us. It comes from the Hebrew word Elohim, so the understanding is that while that is a plural word, it can at sometimes, or in some cases, actually be rendered in a singular fashion, and this may be one of those. But nonetheless, make a god or gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, this man who brought us from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Aaron replied to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold earrings that were on their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, made it into an image of a calf. Then they said, "Israel, these are your gods who brought us up from the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. "There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow." Early the next morning, they arose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up early. Now go down to verse 19 through 29 with me. As he approached the camp, this being Moses, and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses became enraged and threw the tablets out of his hands, smashing them at the base of the mountain. He took the calf they had made, burned it up, ground it into powder. He scattered the powder over the surface of the water, forced the Israelites to drink the water. Then Moses asked Aaron, "What did these people do to you that you have led them into such a grave sin?" "Don't be enraged, my lord," Aaron replied. "You yourself know the people are intent on evil. They said to me, 'Make gods for us who will go before us,' because this Moses, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." So I said to them, 'Whoever has gold, take it off,' and they gave it to me. Then I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, making them a laughingstock to their enemies. Moses stood at the camp's entrance and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me," and all the Levites gathered around him. He told them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Every man fasten his sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from entrance to entrance, and each of you kill his brother, his friend, and his neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 men fell dead that day among the people. Afterward Moses said, "Today you have been dedicated to the Lord, since each man went against his son and his brother. Therefore, you have brought a blessing on yourselves today." What an odd way to end this, to think that after the shedding of blood like this, that God would, through his man Moses, say that now they've been consecrated in a fashion. This is a word that is only really going to be used of priests and later on kings and so forth. But in this context, as goes the book of Torah, it's only really ever said of priests, and it's said that they have consecrated themselves unto the Lord by taking this holy action unto themselves in doing what God has said. Holy in the sense that they are set apart from the rest of the tribes and acting alone in doing this. You can only imagine the mayhem and the chaos. But to resurrect a slide from previous lessons, not to rehash the events of Genesis chapters 3 and 4, but to help you understand how this contextually links back to that. And that's the whole point behind why Moses and other writers may continue to use this kind of breakdown in the way they describe very prolific and pivotal moments of outright rebellion. In fact, come this upcoming Sunday, we're going to start our deeper dive in Sunday school in the books of Joshua and Judges. And when we get to the first few chapters of Judges, right there in the opening introductory statements of chapter 2, we've got the angel of the Lord coming from Gilgal to meet the people, and then he lambastes the entire nation. And he uses that very phrase that the Lord said to the woman in the garden, and then to Cain in Genesis 4 outside the garden, what have you done? As goes the concept that they have violated the covenant they made with the Lord, big shocker, right? But that aspect of the covenant of failing to tear down altars and various other things. So when you see these kinds of words and phrases being used like this, it's meant to draw back to those moments of rebellion early on in Scripture to demonstrate that yet again, this kind of sinful pattern of behavior and thinking, while it may be in a totally different repackaged expression, is still at play, and this is part of the problem of why God is, why people are still rebelling against God as they are, and what God is ultimately going to have to do in order to make that pattern stop and to break it. But nevertheless, just as you have the woman seeing the fruit, and then you have the people here seeing that Moses has delayed in coming down. It starts the visual process of the temptation cycle that's going to come after that. The sultriness of thinking through the process of what seems better in my eyes. In the case of Genesis 3, it's the choice between two sources of wisdom in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God has completely forbidden them from partaking of, versus the tree of life. And in this case, it's watch and wait. Wait for Moses to come down. God has obviously summoned him up into the mountain. If Moses is up there and he is doing something with God, and those people who came down off the mountain left him alive up there, we have no reason to think he's dead, because presumably nobody's walked up the mountain to attempt to try to find a dead body. So why would anybody think that he's dead, even though that is not mentioned here, as goes what could possibly have happened to him? But they're wondering, and they have no definitive answer, and they come and attack Aaron. The actual Hebrew verb that's being used here of them coming is not to consult with Aaron and say, hey, so here's kind of where we're at with this thing and what we've been thinking. They're coming at him the way that they have come to Moses in moments of grumbling and complaining, and he is the only one who, from this Moses-Aaron duo, who is tangentially present amongst them for them to go and ask or inquire of or demand things from. And this is what they're doing. The way that we should hear their voices ringing in our ears is that they are demanding of Aaron, you do something. And it seems like their actions, for the most part, might be sincere in the idea they want a visual representation of the God who has led them out of Egypt. They are not, in this case, throwing their allegiance that they have made to Yahweh. Just a couple of chapters earlier in the narrative space, a little more than a month earlier when Moses was last seen amongst them. And here God has spoken. Moses has slaughtered an animal. He has taken blood and he has splattered it on them and the words that he has recorded to that point in time. And he has bound them in this creedal sense to obey everything that God has spoken to them. And they have all confessed what God has said, we will listen to and obey. This is certainly a moment of idolatry, but to think that they are throwing all that away to then start worshiping, say, the gods of Egypt, that they might be more familiar with by name, by personage, by religious and cultic rite, or whatever the case might be, is kind of nonsensical. They are attempting to try to worship the God who brought them out of Egypt, but of course they have seen no form, no semblance of him. There's nothing they can look at to lay hand on or offer any sense of obeisance to. There's nothing they can come and bring their fellowship or their burnt offerings to, which is what they intend to do come the dawning of the next day after Aaron says, we're going to have a great big party to celebrate what has just happened. So they see, they're thinking through the concept of what seems wise in our eyes. This seems like a good plan. Aaron has been Moses' right-hand man. He's not stopping us from doing this. Well, anyway, so as Eve stretched forth her hand, takes from the fruit, so Aaron then takes the gold from the people, makes it into the calf. We have the question being asked by the Lord in those two chapters, what have you done? It seems like it's repackaged here. It's not put to Aaron that way when Moses comes to him and asks him, what have you done? Rather, it's, what did the people do that led you to do what you have done, that you have now turned around and led them into such grievous sin? And then as we have others ponying up excuses for why they've done what they've done, that in every way is what Aaron is throwing out there when he says, you yourself people, or know how intent the people are on committing evil, as if to say, I was completely helpless here. I had no other recourse other than to give in to what it was that they wanted. And then, of course, he makes this rather silly statement of, I threw the gold into the fire and out leaped this calf, when we know he took an engraving tool and he fashioned that thing with the intent of making the very image that was the end product. And granted, we have these exilic statements at the bottom of Genesis 3 and 4 with respect to God sending them out of the garden, then Cain even further away. Granted, there's no moment here of God sending anybody away, with the exception of the 3,000 people that fell to the hands and swords of the Levites that day. And there's no greater sense of exile or separation than to die. So certainly, that is meant to be seen in the very same vein of that. So the sin of rebellion that's happened there in Genesis 3 and 4 is exactly what has happened already in a few ways in the moments in which they have tested God in the brief wilderness wandering that they've had to bring them to the mountain, but nothing has been as egregious as this action has. And so with that, Moses, of course, is going to have a rather visceral response. But before we get to that, let's identify here another pattern that I think hopefully will come to light for us that is also embedded in the mid portion of this chapter. So we're still here in 32. Let's read verses 7 through 14. So now we see it from another angle. We've seen what was going on down at the base of the mountain. Let's visit what's actually happening while Moses is up on the mountain speaking with the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people you brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly." Now, I know corruptly is a word that is littered all throughout the pages of Scripture, but we really haven't covered that much ground in the biblical story so far. Is there any story that you might know of in which it is said clearly in the breakdown of the status of the situation that's leading God to take the action He is, in which it is said that groups of created things have corrupted their way? Noah, exactly. All flesh has corrupted their way. So we're talking about animal and man who are created on the same day and all have flesh, all are ensouled in the scriptural sense, all have the breath of life, and we have no idea in what way the animals have done so, but certainly man and every thought, action, and intent of his heart is just evil all the time, have corrupted their way. Not to say that we have to immediately jump back to make the hyperlink there, but I do think there is something of circumstantial familiarity here in the sense that these people are behaving corruptly. The people of Noah's generation are behaving corruptly. We know that this story sequence is about to end in judgment. We've already read that part. And now, what also will happen is that God, as He has pulled Moses out of Midian to use him as His agent to bring about the Exodus. Remember, Genesis 3, God introduces Himself to Moses. "I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I have heard the cry of my people, the sound of their taskmasters and their bondage and so forth. And so I have come down to lead them out of Egypt and to the land I promised their ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey, the land of all of these different Canaanite clans and tribes. And so unto Pharaoh I'm going to send you." Not, I have come down and I want you to watch me do this, because considering the fact that you are a descendant of those people, you have an inheritance amongst them, so I want you to join in so that you're not left out. But yep, I've come down and I'm about to go to Egypt right now, so get things in order to do what you need to do to take a little trip with me, because you're going to be gone for a little while. No, he says, I'm sending you. And unto Pharaoh you will be like God. Aaron will be as a prophet. I will redeem them through an outstretched arm and bring mighty acts of miracles, wonders, judgments, various things that are used to describe what God is going to do in the conflagration of Egypt. But who is the actual person stretching out their staff over the Nile, striking the dirt to make gnats and all this other business? Who is the one stretching out their staff in the events of Exodus 14 with the actual crossing through the Red Sea? And remember all the creation speech that we read as we were unpacking that. So in a very real way, while obviously there is a clear distinction between Moses and God, sometimes the lines get just a little bit blurred in the story as goes, who's doing what? Not in the sense that Moses is God. And up until Moses' rebellion of Numbers 20, Moses makes it clear that he is giving all credit to God. He is simply repeating what God has said. He never steps into that role, assuming in a prideful way that he is the one who's actually bringing about what is about to occur. I think that is actually what's being fed into this when God says, go down at once for your people. Why is he calling these people Moses' people? I mean, after all, are they not his? Did he not bring them out of Egypt unto himself to be his people so that he could be their God? Is it a derogatory thing? Is he saying this because he is in some way insulting them, and by virtue of guilt by association, he's also insulting Moses? What's Moses done, though? Why would Moses be deserving of such an insult like that if that's what God intends? It seems like because of Moses' position and privilege as head over these people, and again, the way that he is so closely associated and related with God and all the events that have transpired up until this point, God is sharing in this authoritative relationship over these people with Moses because he's the one that has revealed God to these people. They don't know their God. We have no idea what they knew of their God while they were in Egypt, but they do not know this God relationally. They've never known him in covenant union. And Moses is the one who is literally the face of God to them. And it becomes even more profound once Moses starts showing up amongst the camp, and now his face is literally glowing from spending time in God's presence, that it frightens them, and that's part of what we'll talk about tonight. But anyway, so verse 8, they have quickly turned away from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves an image of a calf. They bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. The Lord also said to Moses, I have seen this people. They are indeed a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger can burn against them and I can destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, why does your anger burn against your people who you brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and a strong hand? Why should the Egyptians say, he brought them out with an evil intent to kill them in the mountains and eliminate them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent concerning this disaster plan for your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. You swore to them by yourself and declared, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I'll give your offspring all this land that I have promised, and they will inherit it forever. So the Lord relented concerning the disaster he had said he would bring on this people. There are a couple of things that God says here as he tells Moses to go down. And again, these people have acted corruptly, hyperlinking the corruptly piece with the Noah story. And I think that's pretty much the only actual hyperlink we get with that moment of rebellion and judgment and so forth. But considering the Tower of Babel, and with that, we have the people saying, come, let's build ourselves a city, a tower with its top to the sky. When we start chapter 32, what do we have the people actually telling Aaron? Come, make a god who will go before us. So the idea behind both of these particular positions of the hearts of those involved in these moments of rebellion is, I think, molding God to suit their needs and desires. Remember what we talked about when we were going through the Tower of Babel storyline in our breakdown of the book of Genesis, and thinking through the process of what they were doing and trying to create something of a pseudo-cosmic mountain, a site in which they could unite heaven and earth together in making a great name for themselves. It was not an obstacle they were making so that they could somehow survive another conflagration like the flood. The idea is so that they won't be scattered in making a great name for themselves. Making a relationship with God that will give him what they think he wants so that they in turn can have what they want. Both parties are happy and they don't have to really rely on him so much for anything else outside of the immediate needs of sunshine, rain, crops going, fertile wombs, healthy animals, and children. And outside of that, we don't really need you for much else. That's pretty much the impetus behind every cultic system in the ancient Near East, right? And in a sense, that's kind of the impetus behind what's going on here. We want a God who we can see. We want a God who we can touch. We want a God who, when we know when we offer these things, we are giving it before him. That's what we're familiar with. It's what works best. And even though God has told us not to make an image of anything, which kind of seems a little silly they want to go this path now, yet it's again part of what seems wise in their own eyes, which was what was wise in the eyes of the crowd in Genesis 11. Back to the Babel story. Come. This is God, of course, speaking. Let's go down and confuse their language. But instead of God saying, I'm going to go down and I'm going to bring judgment upon the camp, much in the same vein of what happened earlier in Exodus chapter 3 when God said, I'm going to go to Egypt and lead them out, I'm sending you. He sees, he knows, he's revealing to Moses what Moses can't know, as goes the sounds of joyful celebration at the base of the camp or the mountain or whatnot, Moses is telling, or God is telling Moses, go down at once. And of course, in both stories, God brings judgment upon the people. In the Babel story, from there, God scatters them over the earth. We talked about the exilic link here in the Sinai story here of every man of the tribe of Levi going and killing either his brother, friend, or neighbor, and thousands dying. But notice what happens after those stories are over with. Go back to Genesis 11. We end that chapter with Genesis 12. And immediately at the beginning of Genesis 12, God reaches out to Abram. He calls him out from amongst the rabble of what happened at the dispersion at Babel. And he is going to, through him, start using him to bring an end to this exile movement of dispersing the nations. Of course, it's something that's going to take centuries, millennia to come to fruition. But nevertheless, there's a montage here of an image bearer and some sort of action being brought to the foreground. If this is part of a pattern, there are implications that come with that, then what can we anticipate considering the events of Genesis 11 and 12? We might find something similar here in Exodus 32. What do we find? God says, go down at once. I'm going to destroy these people. I'm going to annihilate them. And I'm going to start over by making you into a great nation. But what does Moses do? He intercedes for them. Now, Abram is not interceding for anybody. There is not a people outside of his own ethnic group, which is pretty small, to intercede for. God is not calling him into an intercessory relationship or a relationship for the sake of intercession for anybody at this point in a priestly way. That's going to get unpacked over the subsequent generations that come from him. Now we're at that point, though. Now we're at that point where God wants to annihilate these people who have tried him, who have tested him, who have rebelled against him multiple times. God seems to want to wash his hands of these people, and Moses pleads that he wouldn't. And again, that's what we would expect, albeit it comes from a totally different standpoint or point of view in this particular story than what you have in Genesis 11 and 12. Does that make sense? Good. And again, it's important for us to recognize these things only for the sake of it should not be surprising when we see things like that coming along later on in the Scripture. And sometimes when you are reading other parts of the Bible, you might come across something that to you realize, wait a minute, this seems familiar. I've seen something like this before. And then you take a step back or two, and then you start mapping out some things that you just read in the text. And you realize these points seemingly connect to previous stories. And then where you can figure out where you are in the story that you're reading right now, in comparison, contrasting it to the stories that have come before that are very similar. Then you can anticipate what's going to come next, and that's what you should be looking for. Because once you see that in the text, you anticipate what the next move is going to be on either God's part, man's part, or both. Then how does God respond? What's different now than how he has responded before? What does God do with human beings and working to redemptively trying to restore them while also allowing consequences to play out in these stories as they do? How does he turn those consequences around for his glory and the ultimate good of those involved while yet, through a sense of justice, punishing the wicked? Does that make sense? That's the whole reason why we're bothering to isolate these patterns, is to make sure we get that. Okay, so to resurrect an old slide from our last discussion on the book of Genesis with the Joseph story and breaking down how in some ways Joseph helps us glimpse Messiah, which Messiah is ultimately supposed to be the definitive image bearer, the one who is supposed to image God the way that Adam was supposed to in the prologal story of Genesis, which takes me back to this slide and the whole idea. That's what Adam's setup is. And of course, that's what Jesus finally brings together, all of these images in one person, which we have never seen or do not see in any personage from Adam until Jesus. We get brief synopses of these sorts of things. Moses, in a way, could perhaps be seen as combining all three of these functions together, but he's never coronated king. Not in the way that Joseph, or certainly a David figure, is, but definitely he's got these functions of prophet, and he executes several priestly tasks. But nonetheless, the idea is trying to capture all of this in one person, and we see that through many of these prolific figures that show up in the story, and Joseph being one of those who have showed up already before this. Now we're going to see this again in Moses. But before we get to that, I want to nerd out a little bit on what I've got on the left side of the screen for you. I don't want to make a huge big deal about it. Let's read the text first, and then I'll explain why I have chosen to make a point of this. So, verses 1 through 11 of chapter 33. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Go up from here, you and the people you brought up from the land of Egypt, to the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your offspring. I will send an angel ahead of you and will drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up with you because you are a stiff-necked people. Otherwise, I might destroy you on the way." When the people heard this bad news, they mourned and did not put on their jewelry. For the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you're a stiff-necked people. If I went up with you for a single moment, I would destroy you. Now take off your jewelry, and I will decide what to do with you." So the Israelites stripped off their jewelry from Mount Horeb onward. Now Moses took a tent and pitched it outside the camp at a distance from the camp. He called it the tent of meeting. Anyone who wanted to consult the Lord would go to the tent of meeting that was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would stand up, each at the door of his tent, and they would watch Moses until he entered the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and remain at the entrance to the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. As all the people saw the pillar of cloud remaining at the entrance to the tent, they would stand up, bow and worship, each at the door of his own tent. Then the Lord would speak with Moses face to face, just as a man speaks with his friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. His assistant, the young man Joshua, son of Nun, would not leave the inside of the tent. So, to try to make a little bit better sense of how the story seems to be flowing as these events are kind of unpacking, with Moses being up on the mountain in Exodus 31 and on into the events of 32. Then he comes rushing down the mountain to find the people doing what they're doing in the camp. At the end of the chapter, we've got Moses saying, "Perhaps I can go up and make atonement for you by seeking the Lord's favor." And so he says, the following day, Moses says to the people, this is the morning after, I will go up to the Lord. So we can presume that he is going to go back up the mountain, all right? So then, on into the events of what's being said here at the beginning of chapter 33, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Go up from here, you and the people." I think that we would presume, going from chapter 32 to 33, that Moses is still up on the mountain with the Lord. That is a completely fair assumption to make. There's no reason for us to think that he has come back down the mountain. Nothing is being said to that effect. But it may just be me, but does anyone else find it a little peculiar here that we go from verse 4, not verse 4, verse 6. So the Israelites remained stripped of their jewelry from Mount Horeb onward, to what it says in verse 7. Now Moses took a tent and pitched it outside the camp. When did Moses do that? We don't have a timeline given for us when Moses ever actually did this. We have to remember, when we're reading these events, our mind is trained by the way that we were reared in school to read narrative genres, to think and assume everything is happening chronological in sequence unless we are told in some way, clued in by the author, either by giving a date and time or told that this is a memory or something to that effect that forces us to realize this is a flashback or something to that effect. But when we go back to places like Exodus 18, where here we have Jethro coming to visit Moses, and he sees that Moses is spending his entire day out there judging everything that the people are bringing to him, hearing case after case after case, and by the end of the day, he's exhausted. And Jethro knows, hey, there's probably a smarter way of doing this. And I don't think what you're doing is really a good idea, either for you or the people. What is it exactly that Moses tells Jethro he's doing? I'm teaching the people. I'm teaching them how to honor and observe the Lord's commands. Okay, but has God given them any commands at this point? I mean, it's not until Exodus 20, 2 whole chapters later, that God shows up on the mountain and then gives them the first of these Torah inscriptions that are going to be given to them on the tablets and then later on enscrolled that they're going to be carrying around with them. So if God has not given any commands at this point, then what in the world is Moses teaching them? We have the great big drama of Exodus 19 and God showing up, and he says, I'm going to speak to you first so that everybody knows I really do talk to you and you're not making this stuff up. then I'm going to let my voice be heard amongst the people. And then they're terrified. And they plead with Moses, you talk to God, don't let him talk to us anymore, and we're all going to die. So again, if God did that so that they would know that, yes, we indeed met with our God, we interfaced with him, we heard his voice the first time he revealed command to us, when he gave us Torah instruction, then the events of Exodus 18 seemingly are out of place. In other words, considering that they are there for a whole year, and God has revealed himself, given commands and instructions, and some of this has been relayed by Moses and unpacked for them. He's even given practical examples of some of these things when we go from Exodus 19 all the way up through 23. When is it that Jethro comes and visits them and find Moses actually listening to the complaints of the people, weighing out their cases in conjunction with the law or Torah that God has given, and then helping them understand how this law is meant to be applied and how the wisdom of it is meant to be followed? When does that happen? It has to happen probably after these events of Exodus 32. After the first 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, after the rebellion with the calf, after him going back up the mountain for a whole nother 40 days and 40 nights and getting the law. Why is the whole thing out of sequence then? Why didn't Moses put the events of Jethro's visit way later on in the text of Exodus to give us a better synopsis of when this actually happened? Why does that matter? The purpose and intent for why it's where it is for the purpose and reason why it is. Understand? With that in mind, why do we have this weird little blurb about, at some point, Moses set up a tent outside the camp? And if anybody wanted to go inquire of God, you went to that tent. Now, we don't have record of anybody doing this except for Moses, and these people actually condition themselves to reverence this act of Moses going out and speaking to God. They count on Moses hearing something from God, and he comes out and relays that to them. So I say all that to say, I think this is out of sequence, but it's given to us for the reason that it is, to show us that Moses doesn't have to go up to the mountain every time we hear the phrase, and the Lord said to Moses. More often than not, he's probably in the tent right outside the camp. I mean, after all, that's probably a pretty long trek to go all the way up that mountain for an 80-plus-year-old man. And probably a pretty long trek to come down that mountain. And especially considering that some of these concourses of speech are pretty short in nature. And we don't have God telling Moses every single time, come up to the mountain. There are certain points where God does say, come up to the mountain. In fact, that's how chapter 34 begins, by God saying, which I have for you there at the bottom of the screen, be prepared by the morning to come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. So all these events, and this is why this matters, because all these events in chapter 33 of Moses now seemingly going up to stand before the Lord, and then we have this moment where God appears to him, and he hides him in the cleft of the rock, and he puts his hand over him to pass by. We assume that's actually happening right then, that God, as Moses pleads, let me see your glory, all of this is occurring in that moment. But chances are, Moses is in the tent pleading with the Lord. Not to say he didn't go up to the mountain to intercede for them, as he said at the end of chapter 32. The next day he goes up to God. Presumably he might have come back down the mountain. Then he goes to this tent he's already set up out there. He's conversing with God. And while he's communing with God, he is pleading with the Lord that you would come with us. Please don't consign us to go to the land without you. There's no point in leaving here if you're not going to go with us. Please come. And then God relents. Yes, I will go. I will send my presence with you, which in Hebrew literally means my face. My face is going to go before you. So he relents. He agrees with Moses. This is a good thing. This is what I will do. And then Moses says, while we're here, can I please see your glory? Will you please just show me all of you? I want to see all of you, and I want to know you, right? And then God tells him what he will do. There's a spot beside me. I will put you there. You will see the hinder parts of my glory, but you can't see me, which is kind of ironic in and of itself, because God is saying, I'm going to send my face before you, but then he tells Moses, if anybody sees my face, then he'll die. How that happens, not sure, as goes how God sends his face before them. Presumably that's in the cloud and fire pillar that go before them by day and by night. And we also have this enigmatic reference to perhaps a member of the divine council showing up in a humanoid shape or figure to actually go before Moses and lead them. After all, Moses is even asking the question here. You've said you're going to go, but you haven't told me who you're going to send with me. Why does Moses anticipate that some person is going to go with him to lead them into the land? It's a little strange when we read these things like that. We should be thinking that. We should be asking those questions and then anticipating the Lord's response nonetheless. But anyway, God says at the beginning of chapter 34, come up the mountain to me, and when you do, bring with you 2 new stone tablets. Okay, so more of patterns, implications, and anticipation. Because it says of Moses at the end of 33 that the Lord would speak with Moses face to face just as a man speaks with his friend. However, considering that Moses fails the people, in other words, Moses has been put positionally into the center place of this entire story to image God. He is representing God better than anybody up until this point has represented God. I mean, no one has done the things that Moses has done. No one has been allowed to speak on the part of God as Moses has done. Granted, you've got Joseph interpreting dreams for Pharaoh, but that's about as close as we get, all things considered. Abraham was considered God's friend. Abraham never did anything supernatural, though. And of course, we attribute everything Moses did supernaturally to the power that God was using to work through Moses. But nevertheless, nobody has been allowed to image God, speak on God's behalf in the way that Moses has done up until this point. But we know how that story winds up ending. But remember, each of these figures are lined up in sequence, one after the other, to show us, pointing back to the prologue of the Scriptures, Genesis 1 through 3, the fact that God has made His image known to all creation through the image bearer of humanity. They fail. Everybody else fails after that. It leaves the story wanting and forces it to advance until we finally get to a figure who stops doing that. And that, of course, is the person who we are waiting on, who also speaks to God face to face like Moses does. And that's what we have when we have Jesus up on the mountain in front of His inner circle of disciples. When they have a cloud descending upon the mountain, Jesus' whole countenance is changed like Moses' face radiates, and we hear a booming voice in that cloud saying, "This is my son." As Moses tells the people before he leaves them, right there at the bottom, "Then the Lord said to me," in Deuteronomy 18, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you." Obviously, that's who are we anticipating as the culmination of this story. This is the one who also speaks to God face to face. As God puts words in Moses' mouth to speak to the people, now He is declaring of this figure, "This is the one who you should listen to." Moving on with Moses. "Now, if I have indeed found favor with you, please teach me your ways, and I will know you." From this point on, Moses comes to learn of God. He has already learned much. He will learn more over the next 40-year trek out in the wilderness, but ultimately he disobeys. This means, implicatively, we are still looking for someone who ultimately reveals God and does so through perfect obedience. You have the scripture there. Back to Moses. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face shone. They were afraid of him. Moses is the only one that is ever said to have this experience with God. His face, his skin actually radiating, bouncing back the eminence of God's radiant glory from being in His presence. But yet that fades, and we understand from the bent or angle that the writer of Hebrews takes, there's a reason for that. It has something to do with proximity, as goes Moses actually being there versus not being there. And of course, Moses' station, as he is but a servant in the house, whereas the son is Lord over the house. Nonetheless, obviously, when we read the events of Jesus' transfiguration, one of the few things that is interspersed through all 4 gospel accounts, our minds should always be coming back to this moment in which Moses is there before the Lord's glory and speaking with God face to face as friends would. So, obviously, when we get to the book of Acts, we have this declarative statement from Peter that Moses said, that very statement from Deuteronomy right there that I've taken out for you. And not only that, but he sees the entire chain of all the prophets who have spoken, from Samuel, who he mentions as the next great prophet after Moses, and all the prophets that came after him, are all in some way alluding back to the idea we are waiting for someone who speaks to God face to face the way that Moses did. After all, it's said of Moses, when his time ends, that God never spoke to a prophet the way He did Moses. Now, whoever said that had said that sometime after all of the pre-exile prophets had come and gone. You can't make a statement like that unless you have either lived through the encounter of the men who God sent after Moses. They speak, which if we recognize in most cases during their lives, they were hated people. Nobody really gave heed to their words except for the ones who did fear God in that time. Much of what they have to say is more or less in the vein of resistance literature. It doesn't become popular until after they're dead and gone, and then people start to realize, some of the things that he said that people thought was crazy actually came to pass. And Moses, who we all revere, told us that was the sign of a true prophet. How about we not burn his literature, and how about we actually save that, because this man was actually a spokesman for God. After all, that's Jesus' attitude when he says no prophet knows dishonor except for in his own home country, right? So it's something of a legacy for God's men to be treated in this way. Nonetheless, the idea is, of course, this is what Scripture anticipates moving forward. This is what Moses is doing in this, and this is how we are to see that account, that Moses is put on a pedestal, but we know that one of those legs is going to give out and he's going to trip and fall. All right, on to Exodus 34. Let's read the first 9 verses of that. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 new stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be prepared by morning. Come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. No one may go up with you. In fact, no one should be seen anywhere near the mountain." Why do you think that is? The first time that God did this, where he is going to call Moses up the mountain, he first says, put barriers around the mountain. Don't let animals come past the barriers to graze. No one can come past it. If they do, they have to be either stoned to death or shot through with arrows, blah, blah, blah. When you hear the blast of the ram's horn, then you can approach. So then, presumably, anybody that wanted to go past that barrier could go past the barrier. And of course, we've got an audience that is invited way up into the mountain to spend time with God. But here, when God calls Moses for a second cycle of giving instruction, putting it on stone tablets, and communing with him for 40 days and 40 nights, he doesn't want anybody near that mountain. Why? What's changed? What's happened? Something with some gold, a little calf that jumped out of a fire that Aaron couldn't control. They all go dancing around it. Idolatry, exactly. The way that these people had broken the covenant. After all, Moses' visceral response, which we just read here being alluded to, was when he comes down and he sees what's going on, he's got the stone tablets. What does he do with them? To say that he threw them and broke them down, or broke them apart, and God did not strike him dead for that, and God does not lambaste him for doing that at any point in this story. Presumably, Moses' actions were appropriate. Now, if this is the words of God's covenant with the people that are now in nothing more than a pile of pebbles, what does that say about the status of this covenant that these people agreed to enter into with God? It's broken. It's broken. I mean, before they ever left this place, before they ever actually started, it's broken. God would be well within his rights, as he spoke to Moses, to say, I'm turning my back on them. They have turned their back on me. I am under no obligation to honor anything that I have said. They have broken the covenant. It's over. It's over. For God to want to now start again by saying, cut 2 other pieces of stone like those, and I will reinscribe the law, is something that speaks to the measure of God's grace in ways that we really cannot fathom. At least not until we get into the measure of what Jesus does for us, obviously. But nonetheless, the idea that God would still want to work with such obstinate people who at this point seemingly have not even repented over their sin. There's not a great massive outcry of grievous mourning and donning of sackcloth and everybody dumping ashes on their head like you have in Nineveh when Jonah goes to preach. So if the people's hearts have not even been moved at this point to show remorse over what they've done, why would God want to start over again with these people? That's a conundrum. But some things are different this time around, because now that God has called Moses up into his presence and he is going to honor what Moses' request was to pass before him and show himself, God, in an effort, or in a sense, is actually going to be reintroducing himself to the people, because now this is what he says to Moses, but it's not just for Moses' hearing or benefit. He says of himself, the Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But then he says this. He gives them something of a warning. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. Why is he saying this now? What's just happened? This massive, egregious moment of idolatry that leads to the covenant being outright shattered. So now God has added in some way some disclaimer statements to this, that yes, this is who I am. I am slow to anger, faithful with respect to expressing my love for those who will express love to me for 1,000 generations. Literally speaking, there have not been 1,000 generations that have passed from the time this actually happened in real human history to where we are now. We haven't even lived out the literal expression of what God has just said here. Be that as it may, considering now this statement that sometimes is perplexing and even haunting for us, the idea that we hear and read things like God will remove our sins as far from us as the east is from the west, and I will remember their sins no more. But yet we read something to this effect where God is also in other places saying, I will not hold the children responsible for their father's sins. They are not to be judged for what their fathers have done. If your father was a murderer, but he never paid the toll for that, the child cannot be put to death for the murderous actions of his fathers. But yet, the consequences of said parents' rebellion can be passed down intergenerationally. Why is that? And better yet, what does God mean by that? What is in the backdrop that speaks to the idea of what's happening here? Well, Exodus 32 in every way is foreshadowing and waving a nice big flag toward what's about to happen in Numbers 12 through 14, when they finally get to the outskirts of the land and they have the option here. And remember what happens when you consider the dual breakdown of how this goes, because in Numbers we have the Lord telling Moses, take a man from each tribe, send them into the land, 40 days, have them bring back some produce and whatnot, give a full report. But in Deuteronomy 1 and 2, when Moses is recapitulating what happened 40 years ago, he says, you said to me, how about we spy the land out? And it seemed like a good idea to me. So I chose one from every tribe, told them to go in, get some produce, give us a full breakdown of the land, come out and give us a report. Well, which was it? Did God tell Moses to do this? Or did the people tell Moses to do this? Or was it both? How did it happen? Story for a different day, and we'll cover that or cross that bridge when we get there. But the point is that now on the backside of what has happened, it's important for us to remember that is an intergenerational consequence, is it not? One whole generation winds up dying in the wilderness. An entire generation of human beings that should have been born in the land are born wandering outside the land and experience all their formative years and make their memories outside the land, having now be the ones to go in and conquer the land because, again, the rebellion of their parents. So it's important for us to remember that this is the reason why, or notice this is the reason why God is making these statements. It's a reintroduction of who He is. He wants them to know more of His character, how He's going to deal with them, whether they're in correspondence with their faithfulness or their rebelliousness. And then God goes on to kind of, I think, reaffirm the agenda of what's going on. If you read this chapter, the rest of the contents afterwards, there's no doubt in my mind, a lot of us have probably looked at this and wondering, why is God giving this random smattering of laws that He has already given? Why is He reiterating these things in a very loose, disjointed way? Let me give you some examples. So He says here, immediately after that, be careful not to make a treaty with the inhabitants of the land that you are going to enter. Why is He saying that? Why now? Anybody got an idea? Consider, before we get into the realm of trick questions, consider what's going on in the background of the story. God, in the beginning of this chapter, has told Moses, cut out 2 new stone tablets, come up to me on the mountain. He has signaled He wants to start over. He wants to give the law yet again. And now He wants to give more specificity as to who He is and what He expects of them and how He is going to relate to them. So if He is starting over, we can consider that in some way an act of new creation. We don't have all the big fanfare of these other moments of stories like the actual creation or the flood or the crossing of the Red Sea and all those things that we've talked about before and how those stories reflect on creation. But with God wanting to start over, and He is making it a point to have a few things known about Him and what He expects, there should be purpose behind that. So I'm going to give you the first one, but I want you to try to answer the next ones. The land is to be purged. Why? Because when they go into this space, it's going to become a new provincial Eden. We've talked about that. I don't have to rehash all that. If it's going to become a new provincial Eden, nobody can be left behind. There cannot be a single vestige of what was there before, because that's like you going out to plow up a whole 1-acre field to turn that into lush garden and growing all manner of crops, vegetables, whatever the case might be. But there's one tiny little 100-foot by 100-foot square patch that you totally forgot to get to because of some rain that sacked in or whatever. And because you never got around to that, got the stones out of it or got any of the brush that was there before that was dead in the winter, but now come spring, it's all blooming again, you realize the eyesore that it is, and you're going to have to go in and cut it out. It's going to be hard, it's going to be nasty, it's going to be violent, and it's going to be inconvenient considering the fact that you could have done it before while you were doing it with the rest of the land. But you didn't, you forgot. You got to get every seed of what was there out of there so that none of that continues to grow, because they will become snares to you, thorns in your eyes and in your side. It's got to be purged, all right? So again, it's reaffirming the agenda, the purpose behind why I entered into this relationship with you and what I want you to do. All right, do not make cast images of gods for yourselves. Why is he saying this? They just did it, exactly. And God has made an image of Himself for the new Eden space. When you go into the land, you are going to see shrines on every high place that's a hill or a mountain. You're going to have altars made of stone that's got all manner of profane images around it, outright shrines, even temples, and Asherah poles everywhere, and all kinds of cultic sects all over the place. I want you to destroy every bit of that. There is nothing under the sun, whether in the air, on the earth, or under it, or swimming around it, that is meant to image me, because I've already made an image of me. That image of me is you. So the only image I want of me in the land are the living human beings that I have sent to conquer and settle this space. A new beginning for a new Eden space. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. This is where it starts to really get weird and random. Don't make treaties. Don't make images. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. That's not in any way connected. But why is he saying it? Just to be random? Little check on learning? What is the Feast of Unleavened Bread attached to? Boom! Exactly. With Passover, it commemorates the Exodus, new creation. He's calling their mind now to the understanding of, this is why I did what I did with the Exodus, to bring you out of there, to make you a new and peculiar people. The firstborn male from every womb belongs to me. Not too dissimilar, pretty much the same thing, because remember, with this, it's part of that ransoming motif we were talking about, which also is another reminder of the Exodus, a new creation, because that's taking your life back from me. You are enslaved to me, but I want you to have this new identity with me in which you're not my slaves. You're a kingdom of priests. We talked about that. You're to labor for 6 days, but you must rest on the Sabbath. What does the Sabbath illustrate? Exactly, creation, and with it, God's ultimate rest that I want you to come into. That's exactly what I want you to do. And of course, they are about to embark on actually making the tabernacle. So he wants them again to understand everything has to come to a total grinding halt when you begin this process. All right, so we've kind of talked about this already. I illustrated it before, but I think it's important that we see these things for what they are when we can find them in Scripture. Chapters 31 all the way up through 32, we have these specific things being pointed out. In fact, I just took little snippets from Bible Gateway of the chapter to show you with the chapter headings. This is exactly what's being laid out for us in this chiastic sense. But of course, at the heart of all this is what happens in chapter 32 with the rebellion there. And then after that, we've got a reverse of this with making 2 new stone tablets. Then again, in chapter 35, let me read the first 3 verses. Moses assembled the entire Israelite community and said to them, So now, after God has spent all this time speaking to Moses and speaking again, now Moses is finally getting a chance to relay to the people what he had heard from God on the mountain. These are the things that the Lord has commanded you. For 6 days work is to be done, but on the seventh day you are to have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest to the Lord. Yet the third time this has been mentioned, hence those orange boxes across the bottom of the screen. In such short narrative space, we have got so much time and energy and effort and focus being placed on the Sabbath. There has to be a clear purpose for why this is, and why the author and maybe even post-redactive editors that have worked with these manuscripts have worked to help concisely put this together for us in such a way to see the primary importance of why the Sabbath is being brought to the central portion of the story here, and so much energy being put into it, as goes God making reminders to the people, or giving reminders to them of observing it. And the same thing with respect to chapters 34 and 35, as goes the new stone tablets, and then Sabbath command at the top, and then the provision of the workers at the bottom with Bezalel and Oholiab. All right. So we remember the temple harkens back to the Eden space. And so for the rest of these chapters, from 36 all the way through 39, it's basically, as I said before at the beginning with the first actual slide of information, we're looking at how these men and all of these other skilled workers who have volunteered to come forward and assist these men in this work, in this big, massive project, are working toward actually doing everything with the exact measure of specificity that God had told them to, with a design that He showed Moses up on the mountain. In the last few minutes, I want to get to this real quick before our last slide. Just a couple of things that I think it's important for us to kind of notice with respect to the design of these things, because we've already had it broken down for us earlier in chapters 20 through 25, but now that we're kind of having our attention brought back to this, remember in chapter 26 that Moses is told, "Make holy garments for your brother Aaron, for glory and for beauty." Before that, we have in chapter 19, the statement being made that the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. The Hebrew word for glory in both instances is kabod. It means glory. It also means weight or heaviness. But it's striking, considering the idea that God shares His glory with no one, or so we might think, but yet with respect to the way these garments are designed, they are meant to illustrate and bring about a sense of glory for Aaron and even his sons, because that's what is also said with respect to the simpler linen garments that his sons are going to don, that they are for glory and for beauty. But it's not to make Aaron or his sons beautiful. It is not to give them a sense of glory. And beyond that, when you consider what is being said, as goes the intricate details of the design features on the inside of the tabernacle. Let me see if I can get my cursor over there. Where's it at? I can't find it. Well, I'll just go point it out. When you look at the curtains that are up here at the top and the curtains on the bottom, and then just briefly, panoramically survey everything else that you can see in this picture, do you see anything else in this picture that has the same color scheme as these curtains and these curtains? The garments of the priest. Why is that? It says here, when you construct the tabernacle with the 10 curtains, you make them of finely spun linen, blue, purple, scarlet yarn. Then you are to make a curtain of blue, purple, scarlet yarn and finely spun linen. And then the ephod that he wears over this blue robe is to be made of finely spun linen, embroidered with gold woven into it with blue, purple, and scarlet. Why does his ephod match the curtains that have the cherubim interwoven all in it, which are to illustrate the heavenly spaces? What does that mean?
Well, the glory of the Lord is present in holy places.
That, and that he is also properly clad for being in this space. In other words, does anybody else wear the same garments that Aaron does? So seemingly, does anybody else get the chance to come into this space and walk amongst the golden lampstand that is meant to hearken back to the tree of life, the table of the showbread or bread of the presence? We haven't gotten to it yet, but of course, just about every scholar out there agrees that those 12 loaves illustrate the 12 tribes of Israel, slathered with that sweet-smelling frankincense oil all over them, that is basking in the ambiance of the light shining on top of them, symbolizing that the 12 tribes are always to be positioned in the illumination of God's holy light being given off from this beautiful tree. And of course, the altar of incense in the background, symbolizing God's glory cloud. In other words, if this is a scaled down Garden of Eden, He's the only one with the proper attire to bring together the schematic of God's space, man's space, in this one single image bearer. In other words, what does this mean for human beings? From the beginning of the story, we were always meant to be the spot where heaven and earth are supposed to come together. It's not a blasphemous thing to say that, considering that is also said of Jesus. Because there are multiple places throughout the Scripture in which we come to understand that we share in Messiah's mission. Now, heaven and earth doesn't come together in us in the same way it does in the one who is God manifest in human flesh. That should go without saying. We are not God. But considering the idea that we were meant to share in the divine being, which is what Peter is communicating in his first letter to these dispersed groups of exilic Gentile believers spread throughout these Roman provinces, this is what he's alluding back to. This is what it means, considering the idea of you and I were made in God's image. The same thing can be said here with respect to these simpler linen garments. Where else do you see linen on full display but these curtains that form the outer perimeter of the tabernacle structure? Meaning that those priests, while clad with beauty and glory all the same, are outfitted for that space, because as priests, but not the high priest, this is their space to perform their ministry. But is it coincidence that when we get into the New Testament space and we encounter, say, the story or moment of Jesus' resurrection, and the women come up to the tomb, who do they find at the tomb who can convey to them what has happened? Who's there? What is said descriptively of the way that their garments look? Like, it's not said like that, but that's meant to be the understanding. That's the reason why they wear white. In other words, there may be a far deeper connection here with the idea, considering what Moses was being told. Make everything that you make according to the pattern that was shown you. What does the pattern illustrate? From the writer of the book of Hebrews, he says that pattern illustrates what was already existent in heaven in some way. Are we supposed to take that full on literally? This isn't the conversation or time for that. But the idea that these ancient Jewish writers in the Second Temple period, especially those people who inhabited the area of Qumran, perhaps the Essene community, as we don't really fully know who it was that lived in that place, but it was a group of people who considered themselves full-on separate from the religio-political environment of what was going on in Jerusalem with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Herodians and the Zealots and all these other peoples. They considered themselves to be true Israel. They even had something of a model of the temple in which they actually performed exercises out there that were meant to mimic in some way what was actually going on in the temple. I'm not saying they had a full-on beautiful building like the temple. In a very wilderness-esque, rudimentary way, they were kind of reviving the original temple tabernacle practice. Maybe offering sacrifices, maybe not. But the idea is that their understanding was that these priests were mimicking the holy ones, those of God's divine court, who were actually full-on doing these things, not offering sacrifices, but ministering in the heavenly tabernacle, which is now meant to be mimicked by these earthly counterparts who are doing the same thing in the vicinity of this patterned structure that they have made that is supposed to illustrate what is going on above is now going on below, as God is seeking to dwell with humanity. Does that make sense? At least in some way? All right. And then lastly, don't have time to read it, but the events of chapter 40 here. What I will say is this. What we have going on here is something of a problem. Because now Moses is going through the full-on breakdown of assembling the garden. In other words, if the tabernacle is meant to be seen as a scaled-down version of the Garden of Eden, he has put all the pieces exactly where they need to go. But remember, there has been a tent for the better part of a year outside the camp that was set up for anybody who wanted to go and meet with God to go to that tent. And Moses goes frequently, apparently, and he speaks with God face to face the way a friend would. Every time he walks in past that inner flap, God's glory cloud comes down and stands by the entrance of that thing. Now, with this place being called the tent of meeting, in other words, these two chambers of most holy and holy place have now taken on the designation of tent of meeting. This is the place where God's community, represented by this tribe of priests and this clan of Aaron's descendants who are representing them before God, are coming to meet with him. This tent is not functional anymore. God is not going to go to that space. And we know that because now his glory cloud comes down upon this tent inside the inner or the outer court. And once that happens, his glory fills it in such a way that now Moses can't go in. Now you have to realize that was kind of scandalous. It had to be. I mean, if let's just say 3 to 4 times a week, Moses is going out to this tent outside the camp, and never once has this cloud permeated the tent so much so that Moses physically could not enter into the space. But now he can't. Why? Why has God shut Moses out? And better yet, even though the priests have not been consecrated yet, that's part of what we'll get into come next week when we start looking into Leviticus. But Aaron is standing there with Moses, and neither he can go in or his brother. We've got a problem. They have finally finished the construction of this space in which God is going to meet and dwell and walk amongst his people, but nobody can go into the tent that they're supposed to meet with him in. Why? And what can be done to resolve that? That leaves us on the cliffhanger so that we can start unpacking that a little bit more once we cross over to the next page, and that is Leviticus chapter 1. But with that in mind, any closing questions or comments?
With the Sabbath from Genesis to Exodus. In Genesis, when God rested, it was the Sabbath. There was no observation of the Sabbath until this point. And now the Sabbath. So it's not a designation of worship, but a more designation of reflecting on creation. And now that they're in the desert, they're at Sinai in this desert area.
Mm-hmm.
And looking, observing the Sabbath, do they have in mind what's to come, the creation that they are going to? Would their mind be reflected more on the new Eden, the land flowing with milk and honey, than the looking back at the Eden that they had? I think they're looking forward.
Yeah, I would say it's possible that they're doing both, that they're both looking forward to appreciate the significance of what that is supposed to mean by also looking back. It's hard to envision when and at what point in this time period did Moses ever actually pen the Genesis narrative, and how much did they talk about the Genesis narrative orally before he actually set to penning it down? How much did they know about it? How much did they remember of the names of the lineages that we see permeating the book and the various Toledot formulas and whatnot and all that stuff? So we kind of have this feel, I think, that they were vastly ignorant of those things, and Moses is kind of just bringing this all out for them, perhaps for the very first time, and that could be the case. Or they could be completely endowed with all of that knowledge, and everybody understands those stories, and even how those stories in some ways have changed from culture to culture that came from Babel. Having said that, I would imagine with all the iconography that's out there on as you survey all these ancient Near Eastern civilizations, and how so many of these temples that are regarded as sacred spaces mimic many of the same features. They've got their own kind of internal holy of holies. All of them seem to have their openings facing the east. They all have them raised on high platforms, whether it's hills or they've made their own kind of artificial mountains with ziggurats and various other things. They're all seemingly reaching back to a point of familiarity, a common core of truth that's shared amongst them all, whether they realize that to be the case or not. And some of these stories, such as not only flood legends, but even many of these ancient Babylonian myths have structures that are very analogous, if not an outright a copycat of the tree of life, and then a serpent who comes into the story and various other things like that. So they may have a pretty good working understanding of what is the true skeleton of that story. But now Moses perhaps is working to bring a lot of clarification to that as they're talking about this perhaps now, maybe for the first time or whatnot. Maybe the Spirit is working amongst them to help them begin to put the points of connection together of, wait a minute, so God put the man in a spot that he wanted to put him in rather than just letting him roam freely across the world. He wanted him to be here, and God seemingly intentionally inhabited that space with him, and then he talks to the man. And he not only talks to the man, but he gives him instruction. God does that the same thing with Abraham. He does it with Noah first, but then he does it with Abraham, and then he does it with Abraham's son, and then his grandson. It seems that God has done that same thing to us, wouldn't you think? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it didn't happen like that. We don't really have a good way of breaking that down and understanding what they could have known. But I would think in order for them to understand the theological impact of what's going to happen when they get into Eden or to Canaan as the new Eden space, and why Sabbath would be so important there, that they would have to draw upon its significance in the creation week itself to say, this is why he is drawing so much attention to the idea of breaking the work cycle to embed this space in here, because we understand now God made it all in 6 days, but he purposefully rested. And then as he rested, he draws the man into that space of rest with him, because right after that, we've got the account of him making the garden and bringing the man into the garden. That's how it would make sense to me. But now I would full on entertain a plethora of opinions out there as to how that could make sense another way, from another angular view. But that's what I would say. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Just from a perspective like morality, with regards to your, not that this holds a ton of significance in my mind, the order in which the Jethro story took place.
Right.
What dictated the morality of the Israelites prior to the giving of the law? I mean, I think that there's blatant instruction throughout for the Israelites throughout the book of Genesis prior to giving the law that maybe could be some sort of conscious dictation for the people to follow. That could give some precedence to the idea that the story of Jethro meeting with Abraham. I mean, I think that there's still a possibility that Jethro met with Abraham prior to the giving of the Ten Commandments based on Moses.
Mm-hmm. I know what you mean. Yeah.
I mean, do you think that's plausible?
Yes, it very well could be. I would go as far as trying to construct a rudimentary pre-Ten Commandment, pre-Decalogue sense of morality amongst these people who are the descendants of Abraham. I go back to the Joseph story. Here he is with Potiphar's wife, and she has been pressing upon him day in and day out. And then when he finally has a moment of conversation with her that we're privy to, he says, you know, my master has put everything in his house underneath my authority, with the exception of you. And so he trusts me in all of his affairs. How can I commit this sin against my master and against my God? Who told Joseph adultery was a sin against God? How did this become something that he recognizes he is morally culpable for? We don't have an understanding of that. You know, of course, scholars would break that down and say, well, you know, this is a slip up on the part of biblical authors in writing hundreds of years removed from the time in which they formulate these 10 commandments. And then as they're creating these stories that happen with their patriarchs that may have existed, but if they did, they don't know who they really were, as goes the stories of their lives, if there was an actual Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Or more likely, those people were probably made up, right? And if they were made up, they're just contriving all kinds of mythical accounts of them in which they would take their understanding of morality and how they walk with God, don't commit adultery, and superimpose that upon Joseph. But we can't take it that way. We understand not only is Joseph a real person and these events happened as they did, but Joseph in some way, shape, or form come to understand that. Much in the same way you could ask the question about Jonathan. Jonathan and David's relationship. How in the world does Jonathan have such a close relationship with God that he understands that David is going to supplant his dynasty? That he understands that this is God's intent and plan for David to be king, and that he is not going to challenge or rival David in this. He would like to continue to be referred to as a prince per se, but even David comes to trust and understand that he can confide in the son of the man who is his arch rival, bent on killing him, and who in the conventional world around would be an advocate for his father and his own self-interests in bringing about David's demise. but yet in some way, shape, or form, Jonathan has come to develop a relationship with God that has endowed him with this revelation of what God's intent and agenda is. That's apparently a behind-the-scenes conversation that we're not privy to understand. So, and definitely there's other instances too with respect to the idea of idolatry being wrong. Jacob giving the statement to clear out these gods, and those kind of things. Why would they think that idolatry is wrong? If Israel, like all the other civilizations out there, apparently arise from this construct of polytheism advancing to monotheism, then at some point there's got to be a prolonged transition from observing a worship of a plurality of gods to then giving all homage to this one God. Why would Jacob, in the early proto stages of Israel's development, have a problem with there being gods in their camp, in their midst, to the extent where he says, get rid of them? Why would he think that offensive to God? Don't know. But
Because
it's there.
morality is objective, that's why.
Exactly. It is objective. It's not subjective. It's not relativistic in any way, shape, or form. And it's something that I would say, based off the concourse of Paul's arguments in the first chapters of Romans, it's written upon the heart. It's inscribed. We know, because of the light of our conscience convicting us, that murder is wrong. And every civilization would agree with that. Well, as always, I appreciate y'all's time.